Hi, welcome back to the Healing You Show with our host Gloria Lybecker, and I'm your co-host Vanessa Harris. And on episode 17 today, we're going to be exploring the topic of loneliness.
Yeah, so good to see you again, Vanessa.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. So just checking in with you, what pops up for you when you first think about loneliness?
Yeah, it's kind of a sad topic for me, I guess. So even introducing that topic, I felt a little kind of flat, knowing that it's something that is quite pervasive and reading about it recently and it impacts so many people. But what pops up for me is how it's possible to be in a room full of people or a house full of people and still feel lonely.
Yeah. And that's quite different than actually being alone. So when people talk about that they're feeling lonely, many times people respond to them with, well, you just need to get out more often. Get a little more busy. Start trying to give them strategies to fix this problem. And that's not the problem. Yeah, so really looking at what is that problem? How does the problem even come to be? And in my experience, it's much more an internal loneliness. There's the need for warmth and resonance and connection that starts even with the eye gaze from being an infant. It's the experience of being felt and mattering and being responded to. When we're responded to with care and warmth and without saying a word, that's a completely different experience. And if we haven't had that, then we don't know what that's even like. And we live kind of in this insulated body. It's like our body's doing its best to protect us from this pervasive pain. Because it's extremely painful.
I'm really relating to what you're describing there with that connection and warmth and that eye gaze, and that it's not all centered around talking. No. And even when you're standing there talking to people, you could still feel disconnected, not resonating, not gotten, not understood, and still feel lonely. And I'm also just getting present to why myself, I used to just feel so comfortable spending hours at home without going out when my children were young and my babies were young, because there was so much of that eye gazing and connection. So you've got these little beings that you are connected to even when they're not talking.
And then recognizing that communication between beings is less than 5% talking. The majority of communication is nonverbal.
Wow. So what that brings up for me is just how much we're trying often now to connect using our telephone, either via social media or even by phone call, but how much we're missing out on. And it's just not quite the same when you're not standing in front of somebody and connecting.
Yeah, so there's a lot. Well, when you can have visual, it's supportive. So I know, like when I'm working with somebody from a distance, when I can see them, there's so much they're communicating with me just from their body language, by the tempo, like nodding your head or shock or whatever it is. And when I work with couples or families, then the way they interact with one another tells me their whole story. Yeah. So it's fascinating how much we can learn when we can slow down to really be present and pay attention to those subtle signals, especially in the face.
And sometimes I'm guessing that those subtle signals are not even in our consciousness. So I know my experience is that when I am speaking to somebody, I've got a few people, some members of my family in my past where I've spent time with them, and then when they leave, I feel like I never got to see them.
Mm.
I feel like I never actually got to see them. This was sort of like, what happened in that meeting or that visit?
Mm-hmm.
They're gone now, but I felt like they were never actually here.
Mm.
And then sometimes also I get triggered by certain things I think can be in a facial expression that I don't even realise. Sometimes it is really obvious. Like, don't roll your eyes at me. Don't huff and puff.
Yeah.
But that sense of, so I'm wondering what's underneath that, and when you can have a visit and the intention to connect with somebody and be with people and then walk away still feeling that emptiness.
Mm. Well, then it would be kind of what's happening in the exchange. Is there an exchange actually happening? Are both people open and present? Because when you're around somebody that's just pervasively lonely, there's in my experience, excuse me, there's a heaviness. It's a real heavy energy because it's a low frequency that's running in their body. And what I've heard many tell me, and from my own past, is a sense of being invisible, that nobody really can see you. And there's what can happen for many is that they also feel mute, that they have nothing to say. They wouldn't know how to say it, especially if you have the complexity of a crowd or even a couple people. Talking one-on-one might be doable, but then it's a bit of a stretch to be around more than that. And some have even said that their experience would be that if they were standing in a circle of people and everybody was holding hands, if they dropped their hands and stepped out, that nobody would notice. So there's a sense of not mattering, of not really being engaged. So, excuse me, just a second. Tried to clear my throat. So there's it tells me that they had a lack of engagement at whatever time in their life where they weren't sought out.
So when I hear you explaining that, that sounds like it could be quite a painful place for people to be. And when you're talking about being sought out, I'm present to members of my family who disappear. And I noticed it when we moved from a very small house into a newer house, which is much larger, with 2 levels, which I find really difficult, because if you're operating downstairs and then other people are upstairs, it just puts a whole different, it's difficult. You actually have to go a lot further. You literally have to seek people out. And it's also easy for people to hide or withdraw. And sometimes that's just because they need space and they want to be alone. My concern is there a loneliness?
And so we only know if we check in. And then that's, again, the checking in isn't so much, are you feeling lonely? The checking in is much more, has many more nuances to it than that. It's even noticing how their body responds as you approach. How are you reading their energy, their body, their circle that they have, energetic circle? Do they slightly move away? Do they open up when you come in? Do their eyes widen with delight? Or do they kind of look suspicious? There's so many different signals that the body gives. Even the position that it has in proximity to other people, the way people stand together. So the body's giving off information all the time when we learn how to listen and actually respect it.
And as you're describing that, I'm imagining seeking out particular people in my life who are either in the same room as me or somewhere else in the house. And often what I'm finding is a lack of response when I approach, because they are absorbed in a device. And I'm starting to get present to why I get triggered so much by the use of these devices now.
Yeah, I'm hearing that.
Because they're not, I'm not even getting a signal that it's like there's a body there, but there's nobody present.
Yeah, their attention is somewhere else. Yeah, so where our attention goes, then our energy follows it. And yet when we come back to loneliness, it's quite different than being alone. Because loneliness is so pervasive, it's like a state. And in order to heal, we need to unlearn how to be alone. So, because it was a learned experience, it's not a deliberate thing. People do not, I'm just going to be a lonely person. It's not a cognitive decision. It's an experience that was learned by the body, by the whole system. And so the need is to have a different experience that feels safe in order to even be approached, in order to even have the throat open up to where you could speak. And then also for the connections of the mind and body to work together to communicate. I remember when I was younger, quite a bit younger, and I had a lot of loneliness. And I can remember looking at other kids talking to each other and wondering, how do they do that? I mean, how do you just communicate with people like that? How do you know what to talk about? I mean, very basic steps. And yet, because of my life experiences, those simple basic steps, those building blocks were missing. And unless we are really being relational, we don't know those blocks are missing. We don't know if there's a strong foundation for relationships to grow. And all of us humans need that. But I'm living proof that it happens because we are neuroplastic. That when we can slow down and use experiences like time, travel, empathy, or unconscious contract processes, then we can go back and we can be with those parts and we can build those blocks that we're missing. And we can only do that, though, when we strengthen relationships of trust.
Yes. That's a really important word, trust, isn't it? That's something that, so what I'm hearing you describe, I'm surprised to actually hear that was your experience as a child, because I would never have guessed that, knowing what you're like now and how easily you communicate and relate and understand, and so that's really inspiring. But the trust, I'm guessing, as you were describing that aloneness and that people not wanting to talk and
they can't.
Yes.
It's closed. Yeah.
So I'm relating to it's not something as a child that I really ever experienced. I've just got a lot of movement in the background. I'm not alone at the moment. There's a few little four-legged creatures running around, distracting. Okay, they're all gone. And now I've lost track of what I was saying. Oh, yes. So I used to spend a lot of time alone as a child, and I'd get a bit bored, but I didn't feel lonely. I always had a sense of connection to something. I don't know if that was to myself. So I'm wondering about that sense of connection.
Well, so we can connect to more than other people.
Right.
So, I know for myself, I always had a real strong connection with spirit. As a child, I didn't call it spirit or God or any of the terms, but it was more to nature. And that really nourished me, and to my animals. So I always had a kitten, and my brother always got to have the dog, but the dog would go with me when I was on my horse. So animals and nature, I felt really at ease with them. But there's a different thing that happens with people, that we need to have relationships of trust, that we can be vulnerable and safe to learn social skills, communication skills, and even how to know ourselves. And there can be a lot of different reasons that somebody can end up with that experience, not to make the parents bad or wrong, but there's a lot of complexity that happens in life. So I think a big part of it for me was that my parents, they were young parents, but they moved several times, all in the space of the same year. And I got lost in that because I was only 6, 7. And I couldn't date stamp and time stamp stuff because that's a very formative year for kids. They're really getting to have a sense of themselves. And so I was losing that. And so there can be hardships that happen in a family. Maybe somebody's been sick. My mother was not well, and so not as available. And then dad's working all the time. And then I'm the youngest of 4 kids. So that has all of its own ramifications. So solitude was always something I loved because I was never really alone with nature and animals. But the relational skills with people, that took more time, especially in group settings. Yeah. So part of it is learning how to ask a question, right? Because if you don't have that modeled, you don't even know how to do it. So we need those mental models inside of us as we're growing and developing. And the good news is we can do that at any age, even if we didn't get it when we were little. But we do need those mental models so we can imagine that inside of us, and that empowers us then to begin to have a voice.
And yes, it's having that voice. I'm here. It's just so important. And I'm feeling really grateful right now for my experiences, because I think I'm one of those people that you described, where you would watch other people and go, how do they do that? How do they know how to do that? And I have people around me now say, how do you just go into a place full of people or a room full of people and just talk to anybody? And I often wonder, I often think, is it just my genetics? Is it just the way I'm made? But I think it comes down to those early years of that connection and always being valued, my voice always being valued, never being told don't speak, or never being ignored. I talked a lot as a kid, but I didn't. There was people external to my family that would comment on that and make kind of digs, but I just was immune to it because my mother used to look at me with just such joy and smile and love and appreciate that aspect. And I think that allowed me to experience being heard and to connect and to ask questions and do all these things you were describing.
Yes. What it also gave you was that internal image of that you weren't alone, because your mother smiled and delighted in your expression. So then you had that surrogate prefrontal cortex available to you in that way to know yourself that you are welcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never felt lonely. Even though I changed schools and I would feel uncomfortable or awkward or sometimes sad because I was missing my other friends, or maybe I didn't belong, I'd have this story, but I never felt alone. And even though I changed schools, I always had my sisters as well. So I kind of carried, I knew I had my little safety blankets.
Yeah.
I'm having those relations, those
relationships.
Relations. So I guess I don't have this fear of loneliness, which I hear a lot of other people describe.
Yeah. Well, many times for me, it's the recognizing that type of loneliness, it's an alarmed aloneness, that there's most likely an experience of abandonment in there, of just being left utterly alone and no resources. And so part of the healing process is then to develop a relationship of trust so that you can begin to learn how to allow your body to receive warmth because it's not used to it. So if it's been void of being sought out, let alone with warmth and care and smiles, then if somebody does come to you and they're really loving what you're saying, you might shrink back because your system is like, oh my God, that's scary. That's too much. It's like an overload, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like just too much. So even if emotion came up in a person, if they come from that experience of not being sought out and not having closeness with trust, then they'll drop a wall down or a shield around that emotion in order to protect themselves because nobody's caught it before. So some of the things that people might think are, well, why speak up? Nobody's going to hear me anyway. Or why try and say something because nobody will understand. Because they don't really even understand themselves. So how could they be understood? And so that's a really important need, to understand and be understood. You know, that's part of making sense.
So is that need to be understood and that need to be known, to really be known, is that something that you would say would be related to that alarmed aloneness? I'm not that need.
That would be a need that wasn't met.
Right. Yeah. Not met and coming up in that moment, not feeling.
Well, they just don't know how to do this thing. They don't know how to engage with life because life didn't engage with them.
So it feels like something at a distance.
Like
so if they're in that space, if I'm in that space and I'm feeling lonely and I'm alarmed, it's an alarmed aloneness, and it's something that people are relating to. What kind of things can they do to support themselves, or what?
Well, it's important to slow down and to breathe first, literally, because when we slow down and we settle our bodies, sometimes if there's alarmed aloneness, maybe they need to actually stand and feel their feet on the ground, because alarmed aloneness in that moment, that's trauma. And so you want to first come back to present. So feeling your feet on the ground is important. Even doing the butterfly hug and slowly and methodically tapping your shoulders. Or you could do the same thing of crossing your legs, your arms across your lap and doing the same on the sides of your thighs. That also could be something. It starts to bring the body back. And breathing, and then noticing what you see. So anytime there's a trauma response, I want to go there first. Breathing, bringing in that oxygen is going to start to bring the system back online. Because we flipped our lid, we need to come back to presence.
So what I'm hearing you describe there is almost like a moment of parenting yourself, because what you were describing, and I haven't heard about that butterfly, but what you were describing is that's what I do automatically and naturally with my children when they're in a moment of distress. And that natural, and the younger they are, I guess the more that we pat children and touch them and soothe them, but it's just an automatic, instinctive thing to do. And I often don't speak. I just be with them, and I find myself taking these deep breaths, like just
yes.
It's almost instinctive to try and tune them into slowing their breath down.
Yeah. Well, and even doing the that right there, it's going to start resonating in the body,
Mm-hmm.
and the inner ear will hear it. Yeah.
All these things that you're describing are things that just come naturally.
Well, they're intended to. They are intended to. And when we haven't been held in an environment where that's just natural,
mm-hmm.
then there's a lot of repairs that need to be made within the system. So first is recognition that it's how important it is that that system needs to learn how to allow itself to be held, how to allow itself to be able to be soothed. Because if it was never soothed, it feels really dangerous if somebody tries to come up.
Oh. I'm feeling a real sadness welling up.
Yeah.
Because I'm present to this instinctive behavior that I think I have that is just ingrained in me or just there, innate. I'm realizing it's not. I'm realizing it's as a result of having a really nurturing, present mother who was really connected to me. And then I'm feeling this sadness about the people in my life that I know who describe what you're describing.
Yeah.
And just, I'm getting present to what their experience must be like.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when we can empathize with that, with compassionate understanding, that sends energetically out a lot of healing. Remember, all of that communication is mainly nonverbal. When you tap into that, that's the healing energy that goes out, and that's the conversation of the body. Yeah. And when you can do that in circles of others, so like I really enjoy small group work because a small group can feel safer, but we can learn through one another's experiences. And then when that resonance is radiating out in the circle, everybody is benefiting from that exponentially.
Yes, yes. I really relate to that small group experience and that little bubble of trust that gets created and everyone experiences that. Yeah.
And then in the small group, then we get to have each of the different group members be mental models within us. So we develop those relationships that we then embody that can be with us anytime we need them to be. So
I like that term, mental model. It's like an anchor, or it's a learning. And I hear people talking all the time about you can't just tell people to do things. They need to be shown. They need to experience it. They need the behavior needs to be modeled, and then they can then retain that mental model and carry it with them, I guess.
Well, that's how we develop secure attachment.
Yes, yes. So what we're describing here a lot, I'm guessing, is related to that, because I know attachment theory is a big thing and people talk about that a lot now. So what we're really describing is, I guess, secure or a lack of secure attachment.
Well, yeah. Well, insecure attachment could be avoidant or ambivalent or disorganized. A secure attachment is what you were describing that you were able to develop in relationship with your mom. So that brings lots of hope and inspiration out for many that it's possible to have that.
Which makes sense when I at times I used to feel upset when my children would run away and run off into the room or run off at the park or just go and explore things, and it was hard work for me to physically contain them and chase them being so young. But at the same time, I think there was a secure attachment there because they just knew that they could go out and explore the world, meet other people, talk to the stranger in the supermarket. And my alarm bells would go off. Oh, they're too familiar with strangers. Oh, they talk to too many people. Oh, they're too friendly.
And they were probably doing very similar to what you did as a child. Yeah.
Yes.
Because they have the secure base, and it would be safe to go out. Yeah.
Yes. So they get to explore going out and meeting new people and doing those things. Because I wouldn't suppress that. I would recognize that they needed to do that. And I just sit there and watch.
Yeah.
Actually, sometimes my son would say to me, when he would walk past people, and he'd say hello so enthusiastically, and some people didn't answer because they were obviously in their own space or not present or feeling lonely or disconnected. And he would say, Mummy, what's wrong with those people? Is their hearing not working? Why aren't they saying hello back to me?
So he stayed curious and open. And he would ask for what he needed to know. Yeah.
Yes. So he didn't make it mean that they didn't want to talk to him. It was like
he did not take it personally.
Going on over there.
Yeah, he didn't take it personally. So that's a beautiful model of that. Yeah.
Mm. So I'm wondering what else. So you were talking about getting breathing and getting present and going through just sort of grounding yourself because out of that trauma.
We need to be able to reach out and to begin to allow ourselves to be held with compassionate understanding so that we can have a relationship where we can begin to practice these skill sets. Because it's slowing it down to really notice what is our inner experience, and for there to be a safe enough place where we can express that and have that caught and understood right there is a part of the healing. So developing a relationship of trust where you can start to practice what you never got to before, because it's never too late.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's where I'm feeling really inspired about that, because I really enjoy knowing that there's solid things that can be done to shift and change these patterns and behaviors.
Yes.
And what I was hearing you describe there was creating an environment where you can actually get that underlying need met, to be known, to be understood.
Well, when you felt so lonely and that nobody could possibly feel you, to have the courage, I want to acknowledge the courage it takes to be willing to allow yourself to feel felt. And that takes a lot of courage. It needs to really feel safe. And that's not something you rush. It's not something you force. It's something you allow, and just allow it to be what it needs to be. It's really meeting that nervous system right where it's at. Nurturing it only as much as it needs, because I don't want to overload it. So it's working on the edges and allowing that to be a visceral experience and honoring the body so that it can come back. Yeah.
Working around the edges. I like that, because I've got some friends that I try and connect with very warmly, and I think I overwhelm them, and now I'm understanding why. I'm like, why do they all want me to love them? Everyone else likes it when I love them.
Well, and that's an important thing for people to start to know. How can people start to become more accountable for how they show up in their relationships? Well, and that's one of the reasons I want to have this show, is so that we can have these conversations and perhaps more people will start to recognize one another.
And what they're going through and experiencing. Fantastic. So if for people to actually access that sense of trust and build that new mental model, is there anything in particular that you think would be, what would be the best step forward? Is it a better off to do a one-on-one connection or a small group, or
well, it's going to be
read about this.
It's going to be unique to each person, but I would invite people, any viewers that we have, to reach out to me at healingyousanctuary.com and schedule a free 30-minute consultation to explore what's going to be the best fit for you. Because that's really where it needs to start, is right there. And then there are lots of different types of resources, depending on what your needs are.
And then, yes, so it's basically tailor-made to each person. There's not one size fits all, which, yeah.
No. Yes.
Okay. Sounds great. Well, thank you very much. You've given me a lot to think about. I'm going to go away this week and be looking at people in a really different way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really important to be able to have eyes to see all the different ways of being with acceptance. Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa.
We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.